The topic of our next panel has really been discussed and hinted a lot today already, and it's about data science and psychedelic research within Oregon. And as a lot of people have mentioned earlier today, most of the controlled trials, laboratory trials that are conducted in North America, they're very slow, they're very expensive ways of gathering the data that everyone's looking for. And there are also an increasing number of these wonderful survey studies and naturalistic studies. However, in the latter category, the data is not necessarily of the regularity or the level of rigor that comes out of the controlled trials. And the Oregon model is truly unique in presenting a very large amount of somewhat regular, normalized data. And it comes almost as a built-in because people are already having these services, and it means that the researchers don't necessarily have to fund the actual trial itself. And as we heard from Angela yesterday, I believe there's already been 600 dosage sessions in the first few months of operation here with just a few service centers operating, which easily and quickly eclipses the number of dosage sessions that have been had under the FDA model in this country at staggering expense and years worth of trial participation. So by this time next year, there's really going to be a flood of data coming out of this that is hopefully going to answer a lot of questions that are important, both for therapeutic use and treatment and other trials and studies, but also to policymakers and people who are trying to figure out a lot of different things to which there's been no great normalized singular source of data for. So without further ado, I am eager to bring back to the stage first Adie Rae, who is serving double duty today as both the moderator and is now going to get to be a panelist, and Allison Coker, who's a research and regulatory analyst at the University of California, San Francisco.
All right. Let's see if this is, oops. All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Allison Coker. I'm a clinical researcher at UCSF, as Kevin noted, and I'm going to share a little bit about our team's FDA-sponsored research program, so the Community Uses of Psychedelics in Safety Study, or CUPS. Now, we're just building out the infrastructure for this study, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about our thinking around this project. So one of the reasons why I really want to highlight this research program is because it actually is funded by the FDA. So the program is really different from my typical work. I come to this field particularly as a clinical researcher and a regulatory professional. So in these roles, most of my interactions with the FDA before this program had been in the context of negotiating the parameters of investigational drug trials and negotiating sponsored drug development programs. So it's been really interesting to learn that in support of its regulatory roles, the FDA actually has this pool of extramural research funds to help advance innovation in regulatory science. So the research areas in these funded programs can be really diverse, and they usually include many public health endpoints. But one of the goals of these funding programs is typically to support FDA's readiness to evaluate innovative and emerging technologies. We know all about innovative and emergency technologies here. So in that vein, they had a particular call to fund research programs in psychedelics to help them better understand the trajectory of psychedelic use and the associated public health consequences. So in response to this call, our UCSF study team, led by Brian Anderson as our PI and Jennifer Mitchell as our co-PI, along with a number of fantastic co-investigators with a range of backgrounds and expertise, both at UCSF and internationally, developed this multimodal research proposal that we call CUPS. So our CUPS program is a series of research proposals using a combination of both qualitative and quantitative methods to gather evidence on and develop methods for assessing real-world risks and benefits of psychedelic uses in non-medicalized settings. So we hope the data will be able to improve efforts by policymakers, communities, and practitioners to regulate the distribution and uses of psychedelics and develop strategies to prevent and address harms related to psychedelic use. So while there are several protocols in this program, I'm primarily going to focus on the data collaboration we have in Oregon today, but first I wanted to really quickly touch on the qualitative programs in our portfolio. So the qualitative community-based participatory research studies that we've developed look at both well-established and novel uses of psychedelics in non-medicalized contexts. So these include a study where we're working with long-standing psychedelic churches to gain insights from the experiences of these typically hard-to-reach communities that have long established practices and a lot to learn from around their safety and harm reduction practices, as well as a study looking at more novel uses, like individuals using psychedelics to augment 12-step programs. So we've only just piloted data collection for these, and as we collect more data, we're going to be conducting thematic analyses of the transcripts from the interviews and the focus groups to learn about some of the practices, as Rosalind was talking about this morning. So we're really excited to see that data move forward. But our project in Oregon is actually focused on utilizing more quantitative data sources to assess the potential for any association between the regulatory changes and psilocybin-related harms. So while there are a lot of ways that we can assess potential safety impacts, and it's been really exciting to be here and discuss some of these different ways with the folks here, this specific protocol is focused on establishing methods to use existing data sets to develop a framework and infrastructure to look at the potential for changes in psychedelic-related harms. So specifically in this program, we're looking at immediate and subacute harms that require medical or toxicological consultation. So focusing on this specific type of harm has allowed us to use and leverage existing data sets, such as the National Survey on Drug Use and Health, the NISDA data set, the Healthcare Cost and Utilization Project, HCUP, the National Poison Control Data Center, to look at changes in use and harms from these national sets. So they do include some degree of regional data, and we do plan to access them, but they're typically pretty delayed and only have limited data. So to overcome this, we're forming collaborations with healthcare institutions in Oregon to get more real-time data. Now, I do want to make clear that our intention here is not just to focus on or look at data on harms. That data on harms becomes really meaningful when it's looked at in comparison to changes in overall use. So we're also looking at changes in psychedelic use to be able to have an appropriate denominator when we talk about these relative risks. So while reported psychedelic use overall is still low on a national level, we have seen increases over the last 10 years, and we expect this trend to continue. By comparing estimates of psychedelic use to potential harms, we can see if these increases in use are actually associated with relative increases in harms. Because we know that use happens in a variety of contexts, we'll gather estimates of use from both the state level NISDA data, as well as hopefully from these ongoing efforts to get data from service centers and the Oregon Health Authority to help estimate use levels. So in the multiple use contexts in this community, we expect to see in Oregon that use in both service centers under Measure 9, and it'll be really great to hear more from Adie about how we're looking to collect data from these centers, as well as more general community use that might not have that kind of data collection. So both of these uses could induce instances where we might need a medical or toxicological consult. So to look at these particular harms, we're collaborating with local institutions to collect patient-level data on visits where there might be a potential that it was related to psychedelic use. And that same institutional data set will be used to look at both retrospective data before these changes were in place and ongoing current data to look at the effects over time and potentially see if these visits might be associated with regulatory changes. So in defining the inclusion criteria for the group, we're looking primarily at a couple different diagnosis codes of interest in the F16 and T40 codes around hallucinogen-related use and poisoning. And to cast a more broad net, we'll also review cases that have more psychoactive or unspecified psychosis. One of the interesting things that came up while we were defining the inclusion data for this cohort is that we looked at the HCUP data for similar diagnosis codes over the last few years. And while we did find that hallucinogen-related ER visits were a very small percentage of the overall visits, we noticed this notable difference between the ICD-9 and ICD-10 coding. So it seems that there was a change around the coding for hallucinogen use where they became more refined in ICD-10 and there were less of these catch-all codes. And as a result, we're seeing a marked difference in how these data sets show up. So we're gonna investigate this more on the national level, but it also gave us a really clear indication that as we're looking at comparisons between the previous data and ongoing data, we really want to focus on ICD-10 codes, so that's not a confounding factor. So from this cohort, we're going to gather our patient-level data on the encounter, and contextual information to help understand what these groups might look like. And we'll take these data collected from across different emergency rooms from multiple institutional collaborations to compile the data on the patients and outcomes to look for any associations that might help determine what risk factors might there be for having these types of psychedelic-related healthcare encounters. So these might include things like patient characteristics of who might be most likely to need medical consultation, frequency of these types of events, and the types of outcomes from these events. One of the advantages of using these existing medical record data is that it allows us to tap into a system of data capture that already exists, so it will be applicable and able to be implemented across regions. So this will allow for regional and temporal comparisons to whatever else we might look at, other localities that might have enacted similar policies, or to neighboring ones that haven't. So we can use the existing data analysis framework that can be applied. So I'm missing a couple slides, so I'm just gonna stay here for just one more minute. We talked a lot about, looking at different bits of harms, and I wanna make sure that we're putting this in the context of use, and I see this as a couple different options that we might see, such that we could see a relative change in use where use is increasing and there is a relative increase in harms. I think that's what everybody's worried about. We could see them change together where there's not a relative increase in harms, or we could potentially see a decrease in harms if we have more education and more use in these controlled settings. So there's lots of different outcomes, and by looking at these data sets across regions, we hope to be able to see how these patterns fall out across different regions. And finally, we do recognize that this analysis comes with a really notable limitation, that this will only capture data of a very particular kind of acute harm that solicits medical intervention. So it only provides a really small piece of the puzzle of what's actually happening. And so we see this as one piece of the puzzle that will be complementary data that's being collected by this community. So this will complement the data on community engagement, the data from the service centers, and the data from clinical trials, all of which will come together to give us a more robust understanding and be able to answer all these different questions that come up as we develop this future landscape with multiple types of psychedelic uses side by side. Thank you.
It's me again. It is my honor and privilege today to share my team's work. So I'm here representing a number of other really brilliant researchers, and Todd in particular, Todd Porthis, wanted to apologize for not being able to attend. He's in an in-person MDMA retreat at CIIS. So I'm going to be talking to you today about all of the activities that are going on at the Oregon Psilocybin Evaluation Nexus, or OPEN. So we're all here in this room because we're aware that this is a brand new opportunity, brand new program, and it's very clear that the entire world is watching us. So we want to be very careful that whatever we do in Oregon, we're doing it mindfully, carefully, and elegantly, so that we're setting a great example for the rest of our community globally. The three things that OPEN is the most interested in is collecting information so that we can ensure safety, so that we can measure the effectiveness of psilocybin services, and assess equity, how equitably they are being distributed. I use the word effectiveness here intentionally rather than efficacy or outcomes, because we're very mindful that the success of the program doesn't necessarily mean healing. It simply means success, and we'll get into how we're going to define that. So of course, all of the statute and the regs that the Oregon Health Authority are putting together tell us how that we can implement psilocybin services, right? How do we license people? How do we produce these little mushrooms? How do we test them and track where they are? But what the OHA and what the program itself doesn't do is tell the global community why they should implement their own program like this, right? And so those three critical elements of the why, again, are safety, equity, and success or effectiveness. So that's why we're here, right? We understand that the OHA has a huge burden in terms of administering the program, that our facilitators and service centers also have a huge burden in providing services, holding space for people, providing meaningful and safe experiences, running businesses in a 280E environment. It's chaotic. And so our role is really to fill in the gaps, relying on our expertise so that we can tie together these disparate parts of the system, right? Making sure that the regulations and the practice make sense together. So what are we? Open is a community-wide research cooperative. So it's not just the steering committee members, it's not just the academic researchers that are, sitting up at OHSU on the hill behind me. It's really the entire community. So it is an interdisciplinary network, but importantly, it is non-commercial. So the whole purpose of everything that we're doing is for public health and benefit. So our short-term aim right now is simply to help measure the effects of the Oregon Psilocybin Services Act. Of course, a lot of what we do is housed at OHSU, which is a huge benefit, right? We have lots of institutional resources like the Institutional Review Board. There are data encryption and firewalls that we can leverage. There's a lot of institutional resources that are really helpful when we're talking about implementing new ways to gather information and conduct research. Of course, all of the information is handled securely, and all of the folks that are involved in this program are involved on a voluntary basis. This is by no means a mandatory process. Importantly, we do have a community advisory council who we meet with on a very regular basis to provide feedback on our work, not only what should we be doing, what are we missing, but holding us accountable to make sure that the things we said we were going to do, we actually carry out. But most importantly, everything that we find, all the information that we gather and synthesize, the whole purpose for gathering it is to be transparent about what we found. And that transparency comes in the form of, feeding back information to the service centers, helping shepherd information to the OHA and other regulators, and of course, making it freely available to the public as well. So what we are not is financially conflicted. We are not doing anything for profit, and we are not a data marketplace, right? And the other folks who work on this project with me are Jason Luoma, who's at Portland Psychotherapy. There's Todd Porthos, who I mentioned earlier, who couldn't be here today. Chris Stopper, you've heard from already today. And Alyssa Bazinet, who's also an important member of the community doing ketamine infusions. So this is our core steering committee who's really started to kick off this work. Now, if you're sitting in this room, then there's a good chance that you're questioning why this research ethics slide might be up, because as a person who is sort of immersed in the culture of research, you kind of take for granted that, of course, in today's modern era, all research is done ethically. But the unfortunate truth is that out in the community, there's a misunderstanding about the ethical conduct of research. Lay people and members of the community, who might eventually benefit from receiving psilocybin services, they are understandably concerned about their privacy, especially when it comes to reporting to government officials or, just very sensitive information that they don't want to be shared with anyone. So I just want to reinforce that all of the people that you've seen before on this slide, we've all undergone extensive training in research ethics to make sure that our human participants are treated with respect for their benefit and with justice. We also see psychedelic data as a shared natural resource in the exact same way that clean air and clean water are, right? The purpose of this resource is for public benefit, that collectively we will steward that data and then we will treat it with the highest standards, right? The toughest standards for data encryption and security possible. In typical overachiever fashion, I have way too many slides, so I'm going to focus on the key nuggets that I think are the most important to cover today. So our goal is to create useful tools for the psilocybin services community and to deploy those tools so that we can collectively gather information, share wisdom with one another, and be transparent about how successful this program is. Importantly, part of our goal is outreach, and that is reaching out to you, everyone in this room, to say, we want you to be involved, so please get in touch with us, and there will be an opportunity to do that later. And then, of course, dissemination. There's 4 projects that we're working on right now. I'm really going to focus on one of them, which is, numbers 1 and 4 are expert consensus about how do we define safety and how do we define quality. And then once we have those definitions met, how do we reach out to the client community and see, was this a successful experience for you and was it safe for you? So those 2 projects are very closely related. So for the expert consensus, we did a bunch of interviews with psilocybin experts and basically asked them, what does a physical, what are the structural elements to a safe experience? What are the processes you use for a safe experience? And what kind of client outcomes are you interested that indicate that this was a successful process? So based on their answers, we're about to publish a paper that'll be out after the first of the year. I would encourage you to read that paper once it has gone through the peer-reviewed process. Our experts are telling us, really important things about all the kinds of things that we should be measuring. Of course, psilocybin dose. We need to make sure that we're having discussions around boundary of touch. There's not a lot in there that's really groundbreaking, except that it is systematized, right? This is the first time we've taken a systematic approach to quantifying these things. So there's a couple of other things that are coming out of that work, one of which is a safety checklist, which we think will be really helpful practical tool for service centers. And then we've got a couple more papers on both informed consent and the importance of the personal experience with psychedelics of facilitators themselves. So I'm going to skip over this harm reduction and our workforce assessment projects, but those are ongoing and I'd be happy to talk to you afterward about them. In terms of client outcomes, although we've had 600 people go through, the process already, that's a huge success, by the way. In one sense, we have failed a little bit because we don't have any data collected about them. Some of their information has been, voluntarily collected by service centers, but we don't have any systematic aggregate data about that. And so what our aim is to take all of the things that our experts have told us are important to gather, combine that with everything that SB 303 is requiring facilitators to collect, and then what we really want to do is be able to focus on the gaps. So although the OHA is requiring us to track adverse reactions, they haven't yet defined those, but that's important. What's missing from the OHA requirement, however, in SB 303 is that how do we measure success? So if we're just counting adverse events and we're not counting all the success stories, that's going to give us an incomplete picture of how successful this program really is. So that's our goal, is to create those tools to fill those gaps, turn those over to the facilitators and service centers, and that way we can collectively have a better picture of what's really happening in Oregon. So with that, I'm going to conclude and say that we really need your help to make this project a success. Please reach out to us with this QR code. We're really excited about the opportunity to work together to both conserve the privacy and the dignity of all the clients that are going through the program, while also making aggregate data available for the entire community to benefit from. Thank you.
Okay, so we have a few minutes for Q&A and discussion here. And Allison, I wanted to start with you as someone who has worked on a lot of regulatory projects. And there was a time at which it almost didn't matter what the data said because so few people were even open to the idea of psychedelics maybe having benefits or being responsibly managed. And now there's a phase where I hear from a lot of different places that what policymakers and others are now hungry for is, of course, data. And the risks of adverse effects with drugs is, of course, something that's very well studied, and there's a whole canon of the medical world and scholarship based on it. I'm curious in what you're seeing and feeling is whether psychedelics are being held to a reasonable standard or a standard that is atypical to see in terms of the measurement of risk of other drugs.
That's a great question. I was just discussing this last night as well. It is very challenging. I think that if we had the exact same data and the exact same portfolio and presented it to the FDA, and it wasn't labeled psychedelics and it didn't have this history and baggage and politics, it would be looked at differently. I do think that it is unavoidable at this point that we could shed the baggage of that history and politics. And I do believe that the regulators that we're working with really want to be data-driven. They want to be data-driven and are looking at the data, which looks very good, and find some way that they can support moving science and data while holding the truth of the history of these drugs.
And there's a question here that I think helps inform why your projects even exist, and there's a couple forms of it here, and that is in the National Household Survey and in these big annual surveys that drug groups come out where there's this blob called hallucinogens that we can learn about and what is really a gold standard study and used throughout the field of medicine and public health. What are the problems with definition or granularity where the existing kind of surveys that are largely relied upon by policymakers and others, why are they insufficient for the kind of things we're talking about here? And what is a hallucinogen or an adverse event anyway?
Well, I'll start, I guess, from my perspective, hallucinogen is an antiquated term, that the more precise definition would be a psychedelic, something that is consciousness manifesting. I think that the word hallucinogen is a little loaded and carries some cultural baggage. The problem with the NUSDA, the National Drug Use Survey, is, of course, the lack of granularity, putting all of these substances into the same bucket. I'll give a prime example of there's just not enough information that they collect. So, for example, where are you sourcing your substances? Are you growing them yourself? Are they coming from a licensed service center where the potency has been tested? Are you buying them off Snapchat from some dude? Drug sourcing is a huge component of the risks of taking drugs. So there's a lot to be desired from these nationally representative surveys, not just in patterns of use, but motivations for use, perceptions of use, outcomes of use. There's just so much more work that needs to be done.
Yeah, absolutely. I have found in some of the more in-depth data sets, I have appreciated that for many of the substances, they go down to the substance by substance level. I don't think that those substances have been really up to date. So they have really detailed information on PCP, but not any really detailed information on psilocybin. So that's one of the updates that's coming, that they'll add more detailed information on psilocybin. One of the points that I was making towards the end is that all of these different pieces give us one little bit of the picture. So I don't think it's an adequate data set by any means, but for scaling and when we're thinking about regulators and policymakers and fear, which I think is a real thing that comes up, being able to scale what percentage of folks we're actually talking about here, I think is really important. So I like to use those types of surveys for that type of information. And then for the more granular contexting, we have other data sources that are much better to answer those.
So there's another hot question here that I think ties into a lot of what we heard from yesterday. We heard a lot from facilitators and service center operators, and also a lot of scientists this morning who did talk about harm, risk, adverse effects. And a lot of people out there in the audience apparently want to know, and I present this to you as people who I suspect might be interested in the beneficial effects of psychedelics, perhaps reaching more people. Do you have any concern that all of this discussion or data collection or reporting about adverse events, risks, and harm might make the FDA or other regulators or the public or policymakers more skeptical of psychedelics and undo some of the benefit of the last few years?
On the contrary, especially when it comes to the denominator, right? If we're only tracking adverse outcomes, but we're not tracking the total number of, quote, successful sessions, then, it's a big black box. What are those Oregonians doing out there? So the lack of transparency is exactly what will draw the scrutiny of the feds.
Yeah.
The feds.
So as we're having, because the FDA is so collaborating with us on this program, we do get to meet with them every quarter, and they've been really interested in seeing this data. And that's one of the things that I'm the most conscious of in all of our reporting, is making sure that everything is to put into context, because there will be risks, but there are also benefits. There are also many people. And so the context of the denominator, the context of the benefits, the context of what group this was collected in versus this, and ensuring that we're communicating a full picture and a full story to the FDA.
And Adie, question for you, in that there is, I think, a desire by a lot of people to get this data out there. Can you just walk through, though, how privacy is protected and what data does the facilitator have, the service center have, what is communicated to the Oregon Health Authority, and what is the matter by which data would wind up in your project? And how is data protected, and how do people feel good about opting into data collection, and what data is that?
So glad that we're talking about this. So, number one, if you have sensitive personal information that is being stored at the level of the service center, that is a point of vulnerability, right? So it's up to each individual service center to have their own privacy and security mechanisms for protecting that sensitive information. Now, if you don't store any sensitive information at the facility, then you don't have anything to worry about. So that's why these, and it's not like we're reinventing the wheel here, right? There's lots of research studies and lots of other kinds of sensitive information that have to do with people's health that are very well protected by these rigorous, software, both architecture and protocols. P.S. I'm not a software architect, so there's only so much I can speak to the details of that, but there are standards for data security and encryption. Now, when it comes to how there's sort of two streams of information, one of which you don't have to have personally identifying information about people at all. So we can collect very high-level demographics without sharing any personally identifying information, and that's all very safe to bring from the service center to the open database, and then we can very easily help the facilitators in the service centers export that data to meet their OHA reporting requirements under SB 303. So that's one set of data, but then there's also research data, right? So, and research data, especially the way that we're doing it, is totally different than healthcare data under HIPAA. We have a certificate of confidentiality, which means that it can't be subpoenaed. So like your healthcare data could be subpoenaed by the state or by the federal government, and identities can be revealed. That is a lower degree of protection than research data, which is much more secure.
Okay.